Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. In this video, we're going to explore a lesser-known aspect of history, the enslavement of Black people by indigenous peoples of the Americas. When most people think about slavery in the Americas, they often think about the transatlantic slave trade, in which millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas and enslaved by Europeans. However, many indigenous peoples of the Americas also practiced slavery long before the arrival of Europeans. The history of Black people in the Americas goes back thousands of years, long before the arrival of European slave traders in the 16th century. In fact, recent archaeological discoveries have shown that Africans had a significant presence in the Americas well before Columbus arrived. One of the earliest known examples of Black people in the Americas is the Olmec civilization, which thrived in what is now Mexico from around 1400 BCE to 400 BCE, primarily in the states of Veracruz and Tabasco. The Olmecs are known for their impressive stone carvings of colossal heads, and some of these sculptures depict people with African facial features. The Olmec civilization is considered to be the first major civilization of Mesoamerica and is often referred to as the mother culture of the region. Despite their impressive achievements, the Olmec civilization declined and ultimately disappeared around 400 BCE. The reasons for their decline are not entirely clear, but are believed to have been due to a combination of factors such as environmental changes, political instability, and the rise of other Mesoamerican civilizations. It's unclear how Black people arrived in the Americas at this time, but it's believed that they may have come from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean. It's also possible that they migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last Ice Age. An example of early Black presence in the Americas is the African Muslim slave named Estevanico, also known as Esteban de Dorantes or Estebanico the Moor, who accompanied Spanish explorers on their expedition of what is now the southwestern United States in the early 1500s. Estevanico was born in what is now Morocco and was enslaved and taken to the Americas by the Portuguese. He eventually ended up in the service of the Spanish and became a key member of the expedition. Estevanico's role as a guide and interpreter was instrumental in the exploration of North America, and his contributions have been recognized as a significant part of the continent's history, although little has been taught in schools about it. Another example is the story of the Mandinga, a group of West African sailors who were known to have traveled across the Atlantic to the Americas prior to the transatlantic slave trade. The Mandinga are believed to have used advanced navigational techniques to cross the ocean, and there are reports of them trading with indigenous peoples in the Americas. Because there is genetic evidence indicating that some indigenous populations in South America have African ancestry, it is theorized that it was this group of Africans who migrated to Mexico and other various parts of Mesoamerica in ancient times and intermixed with the various indigenous groups. There are also accounts of Black people being present in pre-Columbian civilizations such as the Maya and the Aztecs. In fact, the Aztecs had a term for Black people, chichimecas, which suggests that they had a significant presence in their society. These early examples show that Black people had a presence in the Americas long before the transatlantic slave trade. However, it's important to note that these individuals were not part of a large-scale migration or trade network like the one that developed during the transatlantic slave trade. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had complex systems of social organization and labor that often included slavery. Some indigenous groups would capture members of neighboring tribes during intertribal conflicts and either integrate them into their own societies as slaves or trade them to other tribes. These enslaved people were often used for agricultural labor, household work, and even as warriors in some cases. But what about Black people? How did they come to be enslaved by indigenous peoples? Well, it's important to remember that there were already free Black people living in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. Some of these free Black people established communities and even intermarried with indigenous peoples. Before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, indigenous peoples had their own systems of slavery. These systems varied across different indigenous societies, but they typically involved enslaving members of neighboring tribes because of warfare or as a form of punishment for crimes. Enslaved people were often used for labor, but they were also sometimes adopted into the tribe and given full rights as members. Evidence suggests indigenous people enslaved Africans, as there were established trade routes between West Africa and the Americas before Columbus. However, there is limited documentation of this practice, and it is possible that any black people in the Americas prior to European arrival were few and not subject to enslavement. When the Spanish first arrived in the Americas, they initially enslaved indigenous peoples for labor. However, as the indigenous population began to decline due to diseases brought by the Europeans, they started to look for other sources of labor. In some cases, indigenous communities began to enslave black people who had been brought to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. When Europeans began importing enslaved Africans to the Americas, some of these enslaved Africans escaped and sought refuge among indigenous peoples. One notable example of indigenous enslavement of black people occurred in the Southeast, where the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Creek tribe of Georgia and Alabama owned black slaves. These slaves were often used for labor on plantations, but they were also used in other ways. Some were adopted into the tribe and given full rights as members, while others were used as soldiers in wars against European colonizers. The Seminole tribe of Florida is particularly notable for its association with the Black Seminoles, a group of black people who were enslaved by the Seminoles, but who later fought alongside them in wars against the United States government. The Black Seminoles were a diverse group, including both free and enslaved black people who had escaped from European enslavement. The relationship between the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles was complex. Some Black Seminoles were treated as full members of the tribe, while others remained enslaved. However, the Black Seminoles played an important role in Seminole resistance to European colonization. They fought alongside Seminole warriors in the Seminole Wars, and their knowledge of the land and experience in guerrilla warfare was critical to the Seminole resistance effort. The Black Seminoles also played a role in the Underground Railroad, helping other black people escape from slavery in the southern United States and find refuge in Florida. This was particularly significant because Florida was a frontier region where the United States government had limited control, making it a relatively safe haven for escaped slaves. In the Caribbean, indigenous groups such as the Caribs and the Tainos were known to have enslaved black people who had been brought to the islands by the Spanish. These enslaved black people were forced to work on plantations and in mines, much like their counterparts who had been brought to the Americas by Europeans. The Aztecs and the Incas, two of the largest indigenous empires in the Americas, also had systems of slavery in place before the arrival of the Europeans. When the Spanish conquered these empires, they continued to use indigenous and African slaves for labor in the mines and on the plantations. In some cases, indigenous peoples would offer these escaped Africans protection in exchange for their labor. However, in other cases, indigenous peoples would enslave these Africans and treat them in much the same brutal way that Europeans treated their own enslaved Africans. The enslavement of black people by indigenous communities was not as widespread as the transatlantic slave trade. It is still an important piece of history that is often overlooked. It's a reminder that slavery has existed in many cultures throughout history and that we must continue to work towards creating a world where all people are free and equal. So, while the enslavement of black people by indigenous peoples of the Americas may not be as well known as the transatlantic slave trade, it is nonetheless an important part of history that deserves greater attention. By understanding the complexity of historical relationships between different peoples, we can better appreciate the challenges and accomplishments of those who sought to overcome these divides and forge new paths forward. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.